Today we finish our series, Places of the Passion, and like I said, we've been visiting the various places that Jesus visited, especially in his last days before he was crucified. Matthew is writing, and as I said, he's answering questions. The main question that he's answering is, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? From the very opening chapter of his letter, a biographical letter, he's answering the question, who is Jesus? And they specifically want to know, is Jesus the promised one of the Old Testament? Is he really the guy? They've confessed their faith in Jesus. They've been gathered as a congregation, but they still have questions. And there are still those who are planting seeds of doubt as to whether Jesus is really the Messiah, the one that had been promised to Israel in the Old Testament. So this morning we find ourselves in the Garden of Tombs. And in the Garden of Tombs, Jesus has been laid. Jesus, the main character of Matthew's story, has been crucified. He was killed. He was killed by the Romans. He was killed by the Jewish leaders. He was killed by the Jewish people. The whole world was involved in the killing of Jesus. And he dies crucified as a common criminal. Well, the 28th chapter opens, and we read it again. Mike read it moments ago. There's a story of a resurrection. But even this story, the resurrection, as unexpected as it is, even for the people that are experiencing the resurrection, as Matthew writes, there are some things I guarantee you were unexpected for his congregation that he's writing to, unexpected for us as well. You see, it's not nice and neat. Many of us who grew up in church are familiar with the resurrection story. And even on Easter, we have the clothes, we have the decorations, we have the food, we have celebration. But there are some things, some details in the story that go missing as we flower up that resurrection. It's not nice and neat. It's not simply, oh yay, we win, Jesus wins. It's not that simple. So we're going to focus this morning on the response, because Matthew wants us to see, wants his congregation to see the response of the people that were living in those resurrection moments. Here's what he tells us, the first thing that he tells us. The guards were so shaken by fear of him that they became like dead men. And then on down to verse 8, he says, the women were departing quickly from the tomb with fear. Well, what word do you notice immediately? Again, something that we don't typically tell in our resurrection stories, right? We are 2,000 years removed from the event. It's very, very easy for us to forget. Again, we've been singing all the celebratory songs this morning. But the main word this morning, and one of the main words that Matthew is using as he chronicles the event, is fear. Fear. And it shouldn't surprise us that fear is a big part of the resurrection story. Fear is a big part of our own story, right? If I were to ask you this morning, what are you afraid of? I ask that question immediately. Something is going to jump to the front of your head. You don't have to tell me what it is. But we all have it. Every single one of us. We have our fears. There's much to be afraid of. And we're living in a moment that looks like it may be coming to an end, or at least it's better than it was, but an out-of-control virus, something to be afraid of. Fragile health, uncertainty with a job, uncertainty with relationship, dwindling bank accounts, being alone and loneliness, not measuring up to people's standards. There's all sorts of things for us to be afraid of, and that we are afraid of. And we all sit here, we know what those are. There's two things about fear, though, that we need to see. First of all, fear is always whispering incessantly, there's trouble out there. Fear is always telling you you're not enough. And fear is also attacking us. The what if question, born of fear. What if? What if I don't get the bonus? What if I don't close the sale? What if I get COVID? What if the unforeseen drains my bank accounts? What if they never talk to me anymore? What if I lose? There is a lot of fear. And fear, especially as we see it in this passage this morning, is driven by two things. Fear is driven by those things that we can't control, things that are out of control that we want to control. That creates fear. And the other thing is fear of the unknown, what we don't know. And all of this is happening in this story. Now, the first thing we saw here, the guards are afraid. There's an earthquake. There's angels. And this is Rome. Rome thought that they were in control. You know, Rome has just crucified Jesus. Just crucified the person they called the King of the Jews. And they laid him in the tomb. Rome was in control. You know, the irony here, what Matthew details for us, he says, they fall on the ground as if they were dead men. There's a lot of irony there. They're supposed to be guarding a dead man. And yet they end up on the ground as if they are dead. They find out real quickly they are not in control. In fact, they find out that there's a lot they don't know. So you got fear of a lack of control. You got fear of the unknown. Heaven is intruding on earth. Angels show up. Remember, as Jesus is getting arrested, and all his friends whip out their swords and they start waving them around, and Jesus says, "Put him back." His comment then was, "Don't you understand that I could call legions of angels, 72,000 angels, if I wanted to stop this whole thing?" Well, 2 or 3 show up. And they're too much for the Roman guard there. One rolls away the stone in spite of Rome. They fear what they can't control. They fear what they don't know. And they're not the only ones who are afraid. Some of Jesus' friends show up. There are women at the tomb. They're afraid of lack of control. They're also afraid of the unknown. You know, they got all sorts of questions. What are the angels doing here? Where is Jesus? And then what's next? They've got all these questions. Now there's an angel standing there saying Jesus has risen from the dead. And that still creates fear. Jesus has been raised from the dead. They run from the tomb in fear. Is this news too good to be true? As they run from the tomb, Matthew tells us, they're actually encountered by the one who is causing all of this. They're encountered by the object of their fear. And oh, by the way, and their joy. We'll get to that in a minute. None other than Jesus shows up. What's fascinating about this, the women become the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection. If you know anything about courts in that day, if you were a woman and you showed up in court, your testimony did not amount to much. It didn't count for much. And yet, every gospel account, women are the first witnesses. Jesus is upending the social order. Jesus is very much alive. And what's fascinating about this, as Jesus encounters these women, his message to them is the same as the angels. The angel, knowing their fear, had said, "Do not be afraid." One of the most used statements in all of Scripture. In fact, this phrase is the most used phrase in all of Scripture. The angel told the women, "Don't be afraid." Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid." In the midst of all this fear, in the midst of what they can't control, in the midst of the things that they don't know, they're confronted by the unknown. They're told twice, don't be afraid. One of the reasons why that phrase is used over and over and over again in the Bible is because those stories in which, or in those events in which that phrase ends up being used, usually is by someone who is from heaven. Whether it's an angel, whether it's God himself showing up on the scene, having to tell people who are being confronted with the unknown, being confronted with heaven, don't be afraid. It's a phrase of reassurance. It's grace. It's compassion. In the midst of the moment for fear, do not be afraid. And now resurrection. One of the most stupendous event. Creating fear. Heaven imposing itself on earth. Women who are witnesses. An angel and Jesus himself coming alongside of them and saying, do not be afraid. In a situation that absolutely warranted a lot of fear. What is it that calms their fears? Why shouldn't they be afraid? What calms fear in the midst of the unknown? What calms fear when you feel like you're no longer in control? Angel says something very, very interesting in the middle of all this. And I think this is where Matthew wants to fix us, fix our eyes, because we will go running to the content here in a second. But the angel, it's almost as if the angel who is talking to the woman recognizes that, first of all, they're having trouble processing all of this. But it's almost as if he stops the entire scene. It's almost as if he stops time in order for those women to understand what he's saying. What is it that gives peace to us? This is what he says. Listen, I have told you. We run right through that. We run right through that sentence. We run right through that statement from the angel. But it's sitting there in the middle on its own, as if he stops everything and trying to get their attention and saying, listen, I have told you. You see, rest and peace and relief from fear comes through the ear. You know, it's what's going on in front of our eyes a lot of times. Now, we can be scared silly by what we hear. But it's very interesting how this whole thing goes down. Listen, I have told you. What is going to come into your ear is what is going to give you the peace, the rest, the relief, the calm from your fears that you need. And just what is it then? What is it that's going to come into the ears? It's simply this. He has risen, just as he said. In fact, it's said twice. Angel says it twice. Why he's saying, listen, I have told you. He says it twice. He has risen, just as he said. He has risen from the dead. God has raised Jesus from the dead. The idea here is Jesus has been raised by God. Now, what's interesting about this is that this should not have been a shock to the ladies. They were all part of that same crowd. Throughout the book of Matthew, 5 times, Jesus says, look, I am going to Jerusalem, which is why we find the disciples and his best friends saying, hey, we don't want you to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. And then on the 3rd day, I will be raised from the dead. 5 times. And yet there is so much fear. 5 times. I will be raised from the dead. And so as these ladies leave the tomb in fear, they then are confronted by the object of that fear and joy. What they are seeing then is Christ's promise that he would be raised from the dead. They're seeing that promise fulfilled. They are seeing the embodiment of that promise. The promise has become a reality. It wasn't simply a prediction, it was a promise. Over and over again, you see Jesus' frustration that they don't get it. They don't understand. Would you please listen to me? I'm going to die. I'm going to rise. And these women are now seeing and hearing the promise. The promise is in front of them, living and breathing. Jesus has risen from the dead. So, you have fear. You have a message that calms the fear. But the last thing we're supposed to see here is that they're not to keep this message to themselves. There are others that need to hear. There are others that need to listen to what the women have been told. The message from the angel and Jesus is also, go and tell. The angel said, go quickly. Tell his disciples. Jesus, go and tell my brothers. Both saying, go and tell. You see, the disciples, they have been living in fear. In fact, right now, even as Jesus is speaking to these ladies, they're holed up back in that upper room. They're all cowering. In fact, they've spent this whole time being afraid. The time, that night that Jesus is arrested, which was just a few nights before this, they scatter. They see the handcuffs out and boom, they're gone. Now, Peter and John, two of them, they show up at Jesus' trial. Peter ends up denying Jesus in fear. And then only one shows up at the cross, and that's John. John's the only one. He flees, but apparently he comes back. But by the time the resurrection happens, Jesus is crucified. They're all in this upper room, fearful for their lives. They're convinced that Rome is coming for them next. What's interesting about the book of Acts we find in our Bibles, Rome was coming for them next. Go and tell the disciples is very explicit. The reason they're to go and tell is because of the message that calms their fears is going to calm the fears of the disciples. The men who need to hear this the most are going to hear relief, going to hear peace coming in through the ears, hearing the message that Jesus is risen. And Jesus has the same promise. I am coming behind you. I am going to show up. The promise isn't simply for these women. The promise is for them. And this then becomes the pattern. Do you recognize the pattern here? Jesus is alive, now go and tell. That pattern was reproduced over and over and over and over by both these women and Jesus' followers in subsequent years. Over and over to the point where we are gathered this morning because they went and told. We're here because of that. Jesus has risen. Go and tell. And they do this in fear and joy, we're told. What's fascinating about leaving the tomb in fear and joy is that now this resurrection message is coupled with their fear. It's no longer brute fear. It's no longer bare fear. They've been given the promise. Now they meet the promise. Fear and joy. It's a reminder. It's a reminder that even as we live in a broken world with our fears, that this message also produces joy. It's both and. It's not either or. And that's the hope here. That's the hope. Fearful people in joy, taking the message to other people who are in fear and reproducing that joy. The good news is here for us this morning. There is good news here. Jesus rose from the dead. We are fearful people. So what is it that paralyzes you this morning? What is it that paralyzes? What is it that entraps? What is it that enslaves you? There is good news here. You know, fear is paralyzing. Fear is at the root of doubt. Fear is at the bottom of unbelief. Fear is always in the mix of depression and anxiety. All of us fear something. All of us have these what-if moments. Whether it's loss of control or simply not knowing the unknown, we are fearful people. We are always afraid of not being enough. But there is hope. There is hope in the promise and the resurrection that those ladies heard that day.
Living with uncertainty can take its toll. The normal day-to-day is replaced with fear, worry, doubt. When our normal is disrupted, our surroundings begin to feel weak. Foundations begin to rattle. Our lives become disoriented. As time goes on, we begin to lose sight of the one constant on our journey: Jesus. The fear is consuming, the worry draining, the doubt painful. Even in our darkest moments, when the last thread of hope is unraveled from our being, we must dwell on truth. We must remember, no matter what is happening around us, God is still sovereign. Today, let us dwell on the truth of Easter. The stone has been rolled away. The grave has been rendered powerless. Death has transformed to life. In our fear, He is still risen. In our worry, He is still victorious. In our doubt, He is still alive. When everything seems hopeless, the hope of Easter remains.
So what is it that you fear this morning? What is it? There is hope. Let's come and spend some time there in the Garden of Tombs and listen to the angel, listen to Jesus speaking to the women. Listen, I have told you, He is risen. The angel and Jesus are speaking to us. They're speaking into our fear. They're speaking into that fear of having to have control and not getting it. Speaking into the fear of the unknown, not knowing what's next or what's coming. The promise that they have for these women is the promise for us. There's hope. That's hope. Now, does this mean that all of your fears and troubles will go away? No. He didn't promise that. He's promised Himself. What He has promised in promising Himself is He guarantees that this isn't all there is. This isn't all there is. His resurrection is a guarantee that one of these days it's all going to be all right. One of these days, it's all going to be okay. His resurrection guarantees our resurrection from the dead. So whatever we are facing, whatever we are fearful of, His resurrection is bigger. His resurrection is greater. His resurrection is our hope. So don't be afraid this morning, whatever it is. Jesus has been raised from the dead for you and for me. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for all you have done for us in your life, your death, and your resurrection. Give us hope this morning in the midst of our unbelief, in the midst of our fear. Give us hope. Show us yourself in these words. May we hear these words anew. May we hear them fresh again and again and again, that you are risen. And that promise is for us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.